Well, it's always an interesting thing to look out for when there's a change in government. Sometimes changes in government bring about very large changes in public policy and and the approach to governance. You think back to Ontario in the 1990s for a very obvious example. When the Ray government was replaced by the Harris government, there was a very substantial change in the direction. People can disagree if it was good or bad, but it was a big change. There was change. Other times, there's continuity. If you look to what happened, for instance, in Alberta, and I won't get into the weeds because it's an Ontario program.
Actually, we're national, so by all means, if you want.
Excuse me. Or our discussion was about Ontario, I should have said. But what happened in Alberta when the NDP government replaced the prior progressive conservative government under governments like Redford and Stelmach, there was, again, continuity. There wasn't a big change in the way that the government performed. So there's continuity sometimes, and sometimes there's big time change. And in the case of Ontario, with the transition from Wynne to Ford, it doesn't matter how you look at it. And even though their rhetorical styles are so very different, if you say was there continuity or was there change, you have to say there was continuity. Very little change in terms of their approach to debt, spending, and overall fiscal policy.
And again, just to question this point, so can the Doug Ford-led government really be faulted for their lack of debt and spending management in the time of COVID?
Yes, I think so, because when we look at the budget and we break it down, it isn't just COVID where we see this similar approach. In every area of public management, there hasn't been fundamental major reform. There's been no effort to really look at government and say, what are we doing and how can we do it differently? If you were to compare the budgets, you would essentially, between the most recent budget of the Ford government and the last budget of its predecessors, you would assume that the new government basically thought that the old government was running the province well, that there was nips and tucks here and there, but we're going to keep the same tax structure. We're not going to really reduce spending anywhere. We're not going to introduce major policy reforms. You would think that the new government was more or less pleased with the prior approach and had some small changes around the margins that they would like to make. So absolutely. And this isn't to say that the Ford government hasn't faced difficult circumstances. In many respects, it has. But they ran and they made promises about fixing the province's finances. And it's very reasonable, even though that's a hard job, to measure their performance against their own stated goals. And they haven't achieved it. And certainly any look at the numbers shows that that's not just because of COVID. COVID's made it worse.
Right, of course.
But you take that out of the equation, you still got a serious problem.
Well, let's look at some of those numbers. Your report suggested the Ford government's 2021 budget will see a spending increase of 8.5% over the next 3 years. And that's compared to 6.6% under McGuinty in a similar period. And again, that period of that 2008-2009 recession. Can you expand on that, the McGuinty recession spending?
Yeah, very similar circumstances and very similar responses. Look, there's nothing easy about governing in the wake of the 2008-2009 recession. There's nothing easy about governing in the wake of COVID. These are hard, but still it's relevant given the promise to do something different this time to look at whether or not they actually have. And as you just showed with the numbers, actually the McGuinty government did more to tighten its belt right after the 2008-2009 recession than the Ford government has done. Which is sort of hard to believe given how much debt was piled up at the time, but the numbers show it quite clearly. They're very close, but if you had to say who did more, it was the McGuinty government. So following that recession in 2008, 2009, the next few years, the plan was, okay, we're going to hold spending down. We're not going to grow as quickly as before, and we'll hope the deficit shrinks over time. And that's exactly the same plan that the Ford government has introduced in its 2021 budget, except it's not being quite as, it's going a little bit further than the McGuinty government did in permitting spending to continue to grow. So the two approaches post-recession are very similar. If anything, though, the Ford government is more cautious and less serious about eliminating the deficit quickly.